In this video, we will be talking about Israelite law codes. We will begin by giving some definitions of types of treaties, as well as types of law codes, and talking about the Code of Hammurabi. We will end the video by talking about the three different law codes in the Torah: the Covenant Code, the Holiness Code, and the Deuteronomic Code. When we talk about law codes in the Hebrew Bible, we are often talking about a covenant. A covenant in the ancient world was a legal contract between two or more parties in which each promised to uphold certain terms. In the Hebrew Bible, we first see covenants come into play with the Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb incident, where Moses receives commandments from God. There are two different types of treaties or covenants that we see in the ancient world. The first type is a parity treaty. A parity treaty is a treaty or a covenant that is established between two equal parties. For example, two peasants making a covenant or a treaty together would be an example of a parity treaty. A suzerainty treaty, on the other hand, is a treaty between two unequal parties. This would be like a lord or king establishing a covenant with a peasant. Because both parties are unequal, this is a suzerainty treaty. What we see primarily in the Hebrew Bible are suzerainty treaties, because of this idea that God is a lord over the people of Israel. Before getting into the biblical law codes, we should first talk about the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi is a Babylonian law code and is one of the first major law codes created in the world. This was established around 1750 BCE, so about 1,000 years before any of the Hebrew Bible law codes were written down. The Code of Hammurabi primarily focuses on retributive justice, which we will look at in the Hebrew Bible here in a moment. These laws are the eye for an eye type laws that you often see in the ancient world. You will be reading some of the Code of Hammurabi for homework, so be sure to remember its background and be able to apply the terms that we talk about here in a moment to this text. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, particularly the Torah, we see three different law codes. The first of these is the Covenant Code, which is established in Exodus 20, verses 22, through chapter 23, verse 33. We also have the Holiness Code, which is found in Leviticus chapter 17 through 26, and the Deuteronomic Code, found in Deuteronomy 12 through 26. In these law codes, as well as in the Code of Hammurabi, we see three different types of laws. The first type is called casuistic law. A casuistic law is essentially a law of cause and effect. It often contains a conditional statement, like an if-then or when-then clause, that is based on case reasoning. As an example, in the book of Exodus we see this law. When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist, so that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability, except to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for full recovery. In this law, we can see casuistic law very clearly with these red highlighted words. When there's this conditional clause, essentially, if this thing happens, then this is the outcome, or the punishment or reward for it. On the other hand, we have apodictic law. Apodictic law is simply a law in which the regulations are in the form of divine commands. These are primarily seen in suzerainty treaties. Again, in the book of Exodus, we see an example of this. Exodus 20 verse 12 says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." In this example, there's no explanation or cause or effect for this law. There's simply this divine command and an expectation that the Israelites are going to follow it. Finally, lex talionis is another type of law that we see in the Hebrew Bible, as well as in the Code of Hammurabi, as mentioned earlier. Lex talionis is Latin for law of retribution. This retributive justice is this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea that we see in some law codes. For example, in Exodus, it says, "If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." Essentially, the idea here is that if you do something bad to someone else, then the same thing is going to be your punishment. Let's look at some of these types of laws in law codes that we see in the Torah. The first law code that we are going to talk about is the Covenant Code. The Covenant Code, as mentioned earlier, is found in the book of Exodus. The primary theme of the Covenant Code is a focus on criminal and civil laws. Because this is the first law code that we see for the Hebrew people, this is where most laws are established on how to govern this Israelite society. Let's look at a few examples of what we see in the Covenant Code. We see this idea that slaves are the property of their owners and do not require any special treatment. For example, this says, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Essentially, what we see here is that slaves are only given acknowledgement as humans in the case of their death. Otherwise, because they are the owner's property, any harm that befalls them is kind of wiped out. In this case, when we talk about slaves, we're typically talking about people who sold themselves into slavery, rather than a slave trade market. For example, if there was a Hebrew who was indebted to other people, he might sell himself into slavery to those people to work off of his debt. Or if he could not make a living on his own, might sell himself into slavery to have house and food. We also see a similar idea with women in the Covenant Code. In the Covenant Code, women are essentially the property of their father, husband, brother, or whatever the closest male relative is. Here it says, when a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if her father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. Similar to what we saw with the previous law, the idea here is that because the virgin, this woman, is the property of her father, the man has to pay the father for her, rather than do anything for the woman herself if he seduces her. Although there is somewhat of an inequality between men and women here, as we can see with this law with virgins, we do see a bit of equality, at least in terms of parenthood. Towards the end of this, we see that whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. These laws are not simply about fathers and men, but do apply to some extent to people who harm women, particularly those in authority. The next law code we will talk about is in the book of Leviticus. Like the Covenant Code focuses on the criminal and civil laws for governing the society, the Holiness Code also has a particular theme. In this case, the theme is holiness, purity, or being set apart, or sanctified for God. What we'll see in these examples from the Holiness Code are that the Israelites are believed to be a people set apart for God's purpose and separated and sacred from any of the other cultures. For example, in Leviticus 19 it says, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The idea here is that the Israelites are called to be a nation set apart because their God is as well. In Leviticus 20, we also have a similar idea, that you shall be holy to me, for I the Lord am holy, and I have separated you from the other peoples to be mine. Here we see this key word of separated, which indicates that these Israelites are a people set apart from other nations. Later on, we'll see how the Israelites interact with other civilizations, and often this is a tense relationship because the Israelites believe that they are separated and sanctified for a certain purpose. Finally, in chapter 18, we see, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes." Although the Israelites have lived and will live in these non-Israelite areas, they are called not to follow the statutes, the religion, the laws, and so on that these other areas do, simply because God is holy and calls his people to be holy. Finally, let's turn our attention to the Deuteronomic Code. The Deuteronomic Code, as you can figure out from its title, is found in the book of Deuteronomy. Even though the Deuteronomic Code was set at a time before the Israelites have come into the Promised Land, it was probably written much later, after the monarchy and the temple had been built. Because of this, we see some emphases that focus forward on this established civilization. One of these is with the Levites. The Levites, of course, are the priesthood who take care of the temple. Before this, however, there was a tabernacle that the Levites would take care of and offer sacrifices in. In Deuteronomy, it says, "If a Levite leaves any of your towns from wherever he has been residing in Israel, and comes to the place that the Lord will choose, and he may come whenever he wishes, then he may minister in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who stand to minister there before the Lord." Similarly, we see a focus on the monarchy. Again, the monarchy is not established at the time that Deuteronomy is set, but is established at the time that Deuteronomy is written. In the Deuteronomic Code, it says, "When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me,' you may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your own community." This verse is interesting not only for this idea that it is looking forward to the monarchy, but also because, as we'll see in Samuel much later, God seems opposed to the idea that the Israelites choose a king. However, we see here that this idea has already been established, and that it's all right for the Israelites to do this. So we might want to keep this tension in mind as we move forward in our exploration of the Hebrew Bible. Finally, and most importantly for our look at the law codes, we see humanitarian modifications. While the Deuteronomic Code would not keep up with our modern-day 21st century societies and what we might view as equality, it has a much better idea of how to treat humans than we see in the Covenant Code. Remember the law about slaves, and if a slave owner beats his slave and he doesn't die, then there's no punishment. In the Deuteronomic Code, we see if a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, in the 7th year you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason I lay this command upon you today." What we see here is a focus on treating people better. Again, this is not a wonderful situation as you still have slavery. But this recalling the past, which we'll see in future videos as a major theme of Deuteronomy. In verse 15 here it says that to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Because of this, the Israelites are called to treat their slaves better because they need to remember that they once were slaves as well. Now that we've arrived at the end of this video, you should be able to define terms related to treaties and law codes, identify the 3 major law codes in the Torah, and explain the key themes of each law code in the Torah, as well as give examples of these.